on. Hello, welcome to tonight's program. Welcome to From Bloody Sunday to Today, the fight for the right to vote. I'm Ann Toback, the CEO of the Workers' Circle, a Jewish social justice organization that builds progressive Jewish identity through Jewish culture, Yiddish language, and activist traditions. Today, our activism at the Workers' Circle is centered around the fight for voting rights for all, immigrant and worker rights, and racial equity. Tonight, we're honored to be co-hosting this program with the Center for Common Ground, a nonpartisan, people of color-led voting rights organization which empowers underrepresented voters to fully participate in elections. And I want to recognize and thank all of our co-sponsors, 23 organizations who are committed to the ongoing fight for our democracy and an end to voter suppression. It's so important today for organizations to be connecting and consolidating our power. I look forward to continuing to build on our collective strength well into the future. We thank our ASL interpreters, Lissa and Melissa from ACS and live closed captioning provider, Beverly Early from Verbatim Caption and CAA Captioning for their support for these services. After I introduce our panelists, we'll move through a series of topics. You may submit questions via the Q&A tool at any time during the program, and we promise to get to as many questions as we can in this program. We'll pause at 7:25 to take questions for Ari Berman, and then again at 7:50 for Lee Chapman and Andrea Miller. At 8 p.m., we're going to close the formal program, but we encourage everyone to stay on the Zoom for just a few extra minutes as we'll be guided to take action together for voting rights by calling our senators in support of the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And now let's take a moment to reflect on the history that brings us here today. On March 7th, 1965, John Lewis, Hosea Williams, and 600 civil rights marchers were viciously beaten and tear gassed by Alabama state and local police at the Edmund Pettus Bridge as they embarked on a march from Selma to Montgomery to demand their right to vote. Bloody Sunday ignited the conscience of the nation and led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act 5 months later. Today, the fight to ensure that every eligible American has the right to vote has taken on new urgency as a paramount issue of racial equity and the cornerstone of our democracy. Tonight, we're going to reflect on our history, where we stand today, and what comes next. And now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for tonight's program. Ari Berman is a senior reporter at Mother Jones, covering voter rights and the author of the celebrated book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Welcome, Ari.
Hey, Ann, good to see you and good to see everyone else.
Thank you. Lee Chapman is the Senior Director of Voting Rights at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Andrea Miller is the founder of the Center for Common Ground, and welcome to you, Andrea.
So delighted to join everybody tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, let's talk a little bit about Bloody Sunday. Its swift and brutal the swift and brutal violence of Alabama police was not unexpected by the 600 courageous civil rights marchers. The expansion of the right to vote to Black Americans in particular had been met with institutional and vigilante violence for generations. In truth, our nation's founders didn't create voting and elections for all the people. Ari, can you please take us back to all that came before Selma?
Yeah, absolutely. You make a great point, Ann, which is there's this tension from the very outset of our history between our stated ideals that all men are created equal. And we'll leave aside the fact that women aren't even included in that statement. But these ideals that everyone should be created equal, and the fact that at the founding of our country, only white male property owners could vote, meaning only about 2% of Americans were even eligible to vote in our first presidential election. And it took a long time to enfranchise people. It took a long time for white men who didn't own property to get the right to vote. And then it took a long time for Black men to get the right to vote. And then that was met by a vicious backlash that took away those rights. And then it took a very long time for women to get the right to vote. And so what John Lewis and so many others were marching for at Selma wasn't just the right to vote, but it was to have a fundamental recognition of citizenship, that we were finally, as a country, going to live up to these ideals that were stated in the Declaration of Independence, that were stated in our Constitution, but really were not met for so many years. And I think that's really what the civil rights movement was fighting for. It was about more than just voting rights or more than just civil rights. It was about fundamental equality under the law that had never really existed before the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Thank you. Lee, the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights is 70 years old. Can you explain to us what sparked its creation and how it was involved in the movement for civil rights that's filled with luminaries like John Lewis and Ella Baker and thousands upon thousands more people whose names we don't know?
Yes, the Leadership Conference is the nation's largest and oldest civil rights coalition, and we're actually made up of over 220 diverse organizations, and our mission is to build an America as good as its ideals. We were founded 70 years ago in 1950 by A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Roy Wilkins of the NAACP, and Arnold Aronson, the leader of the National Jewish Community Relations Advisory Council. And their visionary leadership was really grounded in their commitment to social justice and the firm conviction that the struggle for civil rights would be won not by one group alone, but through coalition. And so while many marched in the streets, sat in at lunch counters and refused to ride in the back of the bus, the Leadership Conference worked to get Congress to pass legislation that would protect the civil and human rights of all people in America. So we lobbied for and won the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1960, 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we are going to discuss today, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and we also helped to organize the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in August of 1963. So we've really been working in coalition with organizations that represent many different constituency groups throughout the 70-year history to make sure that we have a democracy that works for everyone in our country.
Wow. I just want to recognize too that all of our organizations are run by leaders, but are populated by thousands upon thousands of people who really make the movement grow. And so many of those people, I hope, are on this Zoom today watching. Ari, if you can take us to the Voting Rights Act in 1965 when it was passed, and for a time it appeared to be working. Voters of color were registered and voting increased numbers, but opposition to the Voting Rights Act continued. And can you talk to us a little bit about the historical trajectory of the Voting Rights Act and the role of the filibuster then and now to impede civil rights advances?
Yeah, so I mean, even if you go back to before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, only 2% of African Americans were registered to vote in Selma, Alabama. And if you wanted to get on the voting rolls, you had to name all 67 county judges to get on the voting rolls. And so the Voting Rights Act got rid of those kind of tests, got rid of the literacy tests, the poll taxes, all of those voter suppression devices. And it led to just an unbelievable democratization of the South. We just lost recently Vernon Jordan. And Vernon Jordan was head of a group called the Voter Education Project right after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And from 1966 to 1970, when Vernon Jordan was head of the Voter Education Project, which then John Lewis led in the 1970s, they registered 1 million African Americans in the South after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So it really transformed the South and it transformed the country by opening up an entirely new electorate and allowing people to participate for the first time. But it's also true that the Voting Rights Act was immediately met with efforts to try to roll back voting rights and to roll back civil rights. It was challenged as unconstitutional almost immediately. The Supreme Court very quickly upheld the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act in 1966 in an 8-1 decision. The only dissenter was Hugo Black from Alabama. And you'd think, listen, this law has been upheld 8-1. This is at the end of it. This is the end of the debate over voting rights. The Voting Rights Act exists. Let's move on to other things. But there have been persistent attempts to try to roll it back. And if I could just tell one story, I was lucky enough to travel with John Lewis and members of Congress to Selma on 2 different occasions to mark the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, in 2013 and then in 2015 for the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And these were among the most special moments in my life. And they were fascinating because we went to all of the sites in the South. We went to Birmingham, to 16th Street Baptist Church, and we saw the stained glass windows that were bombed by white supremacists. We went to Montgomery, and we went to the place where white mobs threw Molotov cocktails at John Lewis and other freedom riders. And the chief of police in Montgomery actually apologized to John Lewis and gave him his badge for the first time. It was the first time a police officer had ever apologized to John Lewis for what he had done. And then we went, of course, to Selma, and we crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2013 in a smaller crowd. And then in 2015, when 100,000 people, including Barack Obama, were there. But there was this incredible duality to the trips, because the trip in 2013 took place right after the Supreme Court heard oral arguments to gut the Voting Rights Act. And John Lewis told me he almost cried when he heard Antonin Scalia say that the Voting Rights Act had led to a racial entitlement. And so we're celebrating all of this progress, but at the same time, the Voting Rights Act is about to be weakened. And then we go back in 2015 for the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And everyone's talking about how much things have changed, how John Lewis is the conscience of the Congress, and Barack Obama is there as the first Black president. But the Voting Rights Act has been gutted. But the law that everyone is celebrating has been severely weakened. And so I think it just goes to show you that this tension throughout American history, it didn't end after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. It didn't end once people like John Lewis had been elected to the Congress, that there remained this persistent strand throughout American history to try to roll back those moments of progress. And I think John Lewis pretty much lived through all of it in his lifetime. He lived at the beginning when he had no rights, and he lived at the end to where he was a celebrated figure. But all throughout his life, all throughout those 80 years, there was never a sense that the progress was just going to occur without someone trying to roll it back.
Thank you. What an incredible moments for you to be sharing with us as we talk about how history was made and changed and where we are now. Let's talk a little more about what you were discussing, which is Shelby v. Holder, the Supreme Court's decision. I want to turn to you, Lee, and ask a little bit more about the changes in the Voting Rights Act. It originally had bipartisan support when it was passed. And then in 2013, as Ari mentioned, the Supreme Court's ruling in Shelby v. Holder basically gutted federal oversight. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in her dissent, throwing out pre-clearance when it worked and is continuing to work is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. Can you give us some background on what happened in 2013?
Sure. Yes, you're right about how the Voting Rights Act has always been bipartisan. You know, it was actually reauthorized 5 times in 1970, 1975, 1982, 1992, and in 2006. And every time it was signed by a Republican president. And actually the last time Congress reauthorized the legislation in 2006, the Senate voted unanimously 98-0 to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act. And, you know, the Voting Rights Act, as Ari mentioned, it was really the most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever enacted, and it worked for nearly 50 years. And with it in place, you know, jurisdictions could no longer discriminate against voters based on the color of their skin. And they were stopped from requiring Black voters to pay a poll tax or impossibly count the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. Those are some of the tests that voters had to pass in order to register to vote in the South. But in 2013, it was really a pivotal moment because the Supreme Court, as Ari mentioned, struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County versus Holder case. And since then, we've really seen the floodgates of voter suppression open throughout our country. We actually wrote a report at the leadership conference a few years ago called Democracy Diverted, Polling Place Closures and the Right to Vote. We took a look at polling places that were closed in those jurisdictions that were formerly required to have their laws and policies pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or a federal court. And we found that there were over 1,600 polling places closed in jurisdictions that were predominantly African-American. So, we've seen polling place closures, strict voter ID laws, purges from the voter rolls. We've seen just slashing early voting days and hours. Like, look what's happening in Georgia right now, which I think Andrea is going to talk about soon. But that's all because of the Shelby County decision, and the leadership conference in our coalition right now, we're working to restore the Voting Rights Act. There's a piece of legislation that I'll talk about later that would restore Section 5 and preclearance and make sure that racial discrimination in voting doesn't have a place in our democracy.
Ari, I'm just going to ask you, because I know your time with us is limited. Do you have anything you'd like to add to your take on that Supreme Court, on the Supreme Court ruling and how it's impacted our country?
Well, it's been a devastating blow to voting rights in the states that have the longest history of voter suppression. And you only have to look at what's happened since that decision. Within hours of the decision, Texas put in place a law that was previously blocked under the Voting Rights Act that said you could vote with a gun permit, but not a student ID. A month after that decision, North Carolina rewrites its entire election law to repeal early voting, to repeal same-day voter registration, to add voter ID, to eliminate Sunday voting, a lot of things that Georgia is trying to do now. That was subsequently struck down 3 years later. That entire law would have been blocked under preclearance. You look at Georgia, all the things they're talking about, repealing no excuse absentee voting, cutting weekend voting, restricting mail ballot drop boxes. They would have to get federal approval for all of those changes, and most likely would not get federal approval for any of those changes, given how much Black voters and communities of color use these things historically, but also especially in 2020. And so basically what it did is it took away the most important tool that the federal government had to stop voting discrimination in the places where it has occurred most often. And then, of course, you knew this was going to happen. The minute they got rid of one section of the Voting Rights Act, they were going to try to get rid of the next section of the Voting Rights Act. And of course, that's exactly what they're doing right now. That John Roberts said in his opinion, well, I'm getting rid of one section, but this other section still exists. Well, leave aside the fact that John Roberts in the 1980s, when he was a young lawyer in the Reagan Justice Department, tried to eliminate that other section of the Voting Rights Act. And now, of course, they're back in court, back before the Supreme Court, trying to weaken the Voting Rights Act again. And the question is not, how can we strengthen the Voting Rights Act? The question is, how much weaker should we make it? That was the entire tenor of the oral argument for the Supreme Court. Not should we keep the Voting Rights Act, but how much should we chip away at it some more? And I know we're going to talk about this later, but it just underscores the fact of how important Congress is. I mean, this is the dominant theme, as Lee mentioned, throughout our history. Every time someone tried to weaken the Voting Rights Act, whether it was a Republican president or whether it was the courts, the Congress responded and kept the VRA strong. And what was missing now is that when the courts weakened the Voting Rights Act, the Congress did nothing. And that's the big difference in terms of now versus all of those previous reauthorizations of the VRA. And if the Congress does nothing again, voter suppression is going to absolutely become the new normal. But if Congress gets involved like it has historically done, we can restore protections for all Americans, but we can particularly restore protections that have been gutted by the Supreme Court.
So I have one definition from some people in the audience, which is, can you define what preclearance is, please?
Yeah, pre-clearance is the requirement that states with a long history of discrimination have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. So it applied to parts of 16 states and 9 states in whole, most of the South, and then some other Western states, places like Arizona and Texas that had discriminated against language minority groups. So not just African Americans, but Latinos, Native Americans, Native Alaskans, other groups like that. If they wanted to put in place a new voter ID law or purge the voting rolls or change how people were elected to prevent minority candidates from being elected, they had to get that approved. And this one section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, blocked 2,000 discriminatory voting changes from 1965 to 2013. So I think one of the biggest misnomers about voting rights is that the Voting Rights Act did all of these great things in the 1960s, but it didn't really play a role in the decades after. Section 5 was stopping voter suppression until the very minute that the Supreme Court gutted it.
So it's interesting. We promised to take a few questions now, and some people in our audience are asking us to go a little bit backward before we get back to the Supreme Court's recent decision, well, 2013 decision. A couple of people are asking for you to speak more about Freedom Summer in 1964 and its impact on the Voting Rights Act and on voting rights today.
Well, Freedom Summer was really the precursor to what took place in Selma, which is that so many people in Mississippi got organized, people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses, and a lot of people who are native to Mississippi, and then a lot of people came down to the South. And of course, Freedom Summer is remembered for the fact that Andrew Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney, who was a native of Mississippi, went down to Mississippi and were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan simply for trying to register people to vote. And the thing that I always remind people is that this is not ancient history, that people were murdered in this country just 57 years ago for trying to register people to vote, that people went down to Mississippi and they never came back simply because they wanted to register people to vote. And I think a lot of times we can forget about this, we can become numb to it, but there are people who are still alive that knew Medgar Evers when he was murdered in his driveway, that knew people, I'm good friends with Andrew Goodman's brother, David Goodman, who's an extraordinary person. So people are still living this history today. And that's what's so frustrating about what's going on in Georgia and other states, is that if you listen to the debates in Georgia, so many members of the state Senate, of the state House, they grew up in Jim Crow. They grew up in segregation. They remember the days of literacy tests and poll taxes. They faced literacy tests and poll taxes. They remember the Ku Klux Klan marching through their towns. And it's a very ugly history for them, and they don't want to go back to those days. And honestly, as long as the Voting Rights Act was around, we couldn't go back to those days. But now that the Voting Rights Act is gutted, it's so much easier to slide back into that ugly part of our history.
Lee, can you add anything to what Ari's been telling us about Freedom Summer?
No, I mean, Ari described it really well. And, I mentioned the literacy test that people had to go through in order to register to vote. And it was just, some people had to recite the entire preamble of the United States Constitution. And I mean, that's not something, I'm an attorney, that's not something I'm able to do. Some voters had to count how many jelly beans were in a bar, or how many bubbles were in a bar of soap, like I mentioned, or take these impossible tests. You can Google Louisiana literacy test and try to take it yourself and see if you could actually pass. It was just really, everything was stacked against people. And so that's why the Voting Rights Act is so powerful, because it took into account those jurisdictions that were the most egregious, and made sure that any laws or policies that would make it harder for people to vote were immediately stopped before they could harm voters further. So, all of the work that was done in that summer was pivotal to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And it's something that we need to preserve today. Like Ari said, it's not that long ago at all.
No. And I'd like to ask both of you, and Andrea, you're welcome to also start. Please join in. People are asking what, and in fact, I'll just reference Andrea Kahn is asking, what was the motivation of the justices in the Shelby decision?
Do you want to take that, Ari? Or I can take it.
Sure, yeah. I can take it. I mean, so their stated reasons, John Roberts, the justice who wrote it, his stated reasons were sort of twofold. One is that the country had changed dramatically since 1965, that we had a Black president, we had all of these Black elected officials, that Blacks were registered in Mississippi at a higher rate than in Massachusetts and all of these northern states, but the Voting Rights Act continued to treat the country like it was in 1965, and that that there was no justification for this disparate treatment of the states, that it was unfair to treat Mississippi so much different than Massachusetts, when in fact a lot of those barriers to voting had been eliminated. I mean, that was the stated rationale for it. And I think, as you mentioned, what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said in her dissent was that, number one, the progress was made because of the Voting Rights Act. That you don't throw away your umbrella because you're not getting wet one day, that it was going to rain another day. And also that the progress was a lot more fragile than a lot of people realize. And I think that this decision was a wake-up call because I think there was a lot of thinking, particularly among the right, that we were moving towards this post-racial society, that we had a Black president and all of these things, and therefore things like the Voting Rights Act weren't needed anymore. And then, of course, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, you get not only voter suppression, but you get the police killings and so many other things that then awakens America to the fact that, hey, listen, racism is not a thing of the past. We have not come nearly as far as we thought we had. But the debate over the Voting Rights Act was taking place in a very different context, I would say, politically, than we're in right now.
Thank you. Lee, do you want to weigh in on the motivations behind Shelby?
No, it's exactly what Ari said. The Supreme Court basically said, don't use 1965 data. It's old data, it's outdated. And so what they've done is the Supreme Court really put it in the hands of Congress to come up with a new bill that would restore pre-clearance. And that's what the Leadership Conference and our coalition is currently working on. And that's what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does. So
let me just check in. Ari, you have to leave us at 7:30, am I correct?
Yes, 2 more minutes, sadly.
Okay. I'm just looking to see if there's anything specific for you in the questions. There's a question here from Mark List. Does the Voting Rights Act have applicability to redistricting and gerrymandering?
Yes. In fact, that is one of the key things that the Voting Rights Act stopped, because what happened was, throughout the South, once Black voters and other voters of color got registered in large numbers, the next step was they wanted to actually be able to elect people to office. They wanted to elect the first Black mayors and the first city council members and the first county commissioners and the first members of Congress and all of these things that we take for granted now, but we didn't have in the 1960s and even into the 1970s and the 1980s. And so all across the South and other parts of the country that were subject to the Voting Rights Act, they began to change their election systems to prevent Black candidates and other candidates of color from being able to win election. And a lot of what the Voting Rights Act did, both the pre-clearance requirement and the existing part of the Voting Rights Act, was block those kind of things from happening. And even in the last redistricting cycle, a lot of discriminatory redistricting changes were blocked in places like Texas and other states. And I imagine that that's the same kind of thing is going to happen in the 2021 redistricting cycle as well. And interestingly, the Supreme Court has said, and I think in a very wrong-headed decision, that partisan gerrymandering cannot be reviewed by the federal courts, but racial gerrymandering can still be struck down under the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Supreme Court has taken a very restrictive definition of what constitutes racial gerrymandering, but it's still true that if you draw a district to just flat out, for example, try to eliminate a Black member of Congress or a Latino member of Congress or an Asian American member of Congress or something like that, that can still be struck down under the Voting Rights Act.
So Ari, thank you. And before we turn to what's going on the ground today, is there any closing remarks that you might have for us?
I just want to thank everyone for tuning in. Thanks everyone for hosting me. And just remember that the fight for voting rights continues to this day. And the way to honor John Lewis and all of the people that came before him is to continue the fights that they started.
those words couldn't resonate more closely to us all. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we have a chance to talk again, and I hope we see each other at the forefront of the fight for voting rights for all.
Absolutely. Stay well. Thank you so much.
You too. You too. So now I want to turn my attention to Andrea Miller, who is the founder of the Center for Common Ground and has been on the forefront of battling the avalanche of state legislation proposed since the 2010 election that would suppress the vote. So Andrea, please tell us what's at stake right now and what can we be doing?
Well, number one, thanks, Anne. I was delighted to get an opportunity to listen to Ari. And let's take a look at where we are now. So right now, originally back at the end of January, we had 28 states that had introduced legislation that was designed to make it harder for people to vote. That number has now swelled to about over 40 states. I mean, Washington State has introduced a bill that says you can no longer vote by mail. Everybody has to vote in person. Now, is that bill going anywhere in Washington State? No. But the fact is, even in places where you would never expect it, we are seeing these really, really bad bills. Now, the problem that we really, really, really have to fight is in states like Georgia and Arizona and Texas and Iowa, and there are many, many others where those states are trifectas, meaning the House, the Senate, the governor. So if the state legislature passes a bad bill, the governor is sure to sign it. We saw 45 bad bills get introduced in the state of Georgia. And I want to thank a lot of people that are on this call, because a lot of you phone bank for Center for Common Ground. Thank you. And we decided what we really wanted to help people understand was we wanted to help regular people in Georgia to understand what members of their state legislature was trying to do to prevent them from voting. So we've been reaching out to voters in Georgia who voted by mail. And our audience, or our people, are community of color voters. And we were letting them know if they were in a district where their senator or their House member was a co-sponsor of one of these bad bills. Because what we frequently see in elections is we see people vote for president and US senator and US rep, and then they stop. They don't keep going down the ticket. And we're not really sure why, but so many people stop. It may be that they figure, oh, I don't know these state people. I haven't seen them on TV. There's less money frequently when you get down to these state offices. But for whatever reason, we're seeing all these people that are elected that are so not supporting their constituency. So we're letting their constituents know, because as my mother used to say, an election is like a Greyhound bus. There is always going to be another one coming along. So in 2022, the voters in Georgia and Arizona, we are hoping they will be looking at their state legislators in a whole new light. You were the one that didn't want me to be able to be safe when I voted. You were the one who thought, oh, if we're going to have drop boxes, we're going to put them in buildings and only have them open when early voting is open. Well, if the drop box is only available when early voting is available, and I've got to scan an ID, and you're going to have a guard there, then why am I not just early voting? So just a whole myriad of bills. Georgia has had no excuse absentee voting since 2005. It's not new, but when community of color voters use no excuse absentee voting, oh my goodness, we must be looking at massive voter fraud. And it's absolutely ridiculous. Frankly, I should think they would be embarrassed. You lost, and now you are going to really cheat in order to try to win. But that's basically what we're coming down to. People have bought into the lie that just because voters chose to participate in the election. Now, groups like mine and many other groups, we spent thousands of hours contacting voters, giving them information and encouraging them to go out and vote. I don't know that there has been that much outreach to voters in the South probably since President Obama's 2008 run. It really has been a huge effort, and it paid off. The voters came out and they made their choice. And so this is what we're seeing. So in Georgia, they want to get rid of no excuse absentee voting. They want to end Sunday voting. They want to be able to get rid of election officials who refuse to purge voters. They want to bring back interstate cross-check. Everybody should remember that horror where we compared the names of registered voters across 22 states using their first name and their last name. And gee, when we found people where there was a match, you're looking at 22 states, first name, last name, and even date of birth. You were finding people, not the same person, coincidence. We lost nearly, I believe it was 7 million people with interstate cross-check got dumped off the voting rolls. And most of these states that really were employing interstate cross-check do not have same-day voter registration. So that when the voter presented themselves and was like, excuse me, I'm no longer registered to vote, they weren't able to correct the problem and vote.
Wow.
Georgia still does not have same-day registration.
It's a dire situation you describe, and I think this past election cycle has really drawn so many people's attention to the myriad of problems and the incredible attempts at suppression that were overcome in many instances in the last election by hard work and organizing of the people for the people. I want to draw your attention to this past Sunday. President Biden enacted an executive order that's supposed to help preclude the implementation of these state voter suppression laws. Have you analyzed it, and how much do you expect it to help the fight state by state as many states are trying to pass laws that will have the impact of suppressing votes?
I've seen it. I have not really done a huge analysis. Lee, have you had a chance to analyze it?
Yes, we have. And, the executive order really expands access to voting. So it calls on federal agencies to provide voter registration. It gives federal employees time off to vote. It also does things like it provides voter registration information to people with previous felony convictions who are eligible to vote. It also looks at barriers to voting for people with disabilities. It also aims to make it easier for people who are active duty military who live overseas to vote. And it also creates a steering group for Native American voting rights. But one key thing is that President Biden issued this executive order on the 56th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And although the executive order really aims to open up voter access, he did call on Congress to pass HR 1 for the People Act, which is a bill that we're going to talk about soon, and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Right. So I think now's a good time to talk about that there's so many barriers that are still being faced by people of color, by people who are physically challenged, by people who speak languages other than English, by people who live in remote areas and students on college campuses. I mean, truly by people in not so remote areas who are finding their voting locations so far away they can't reach them. I mean, the suppression is really widespread, and we're seeing it across the country, as you said, Andrea. We'd like to play a very short 2-minute video from the leadership conference to give everyone a picture of what we're looking at.
Voters in Randolph County, Georgia are outraged.
Malone made a proposal to the Board of Elections to shut down 7 of 9 polling places in the predominantly black areas.
And as soon as polling places opened early this morning, the headaches began.
They purged 500,000 voters.
Are you removing black voters from the voter rolls just so you can win this election?
We are witnessing a tidal wave of voter suppression efforts around the country.
This is what we call voter suppression.
It is not letting me vote for who I want to vote for.
Victory in Florida.
Convicted felons across the state now have their voting rights restored.
And I promise you tonight, we're going to make sure that every vote is counted. Every single vote.
Lee, that's a fantastic short video, very inspiring. And can you please share with us the federal legislation that is now on the table that would help end voter suppression across the United States?
Sure. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our Instill I Vote campaign. So you saw Instill I Vote in that video, and we thought it was important to create a video like that because it shows how the voter suppression tactics of the past really aren't that different from what we're seeing right now, right? And so there were a lot of split screens between actions that were happening in the 60s and recent history. So instead of the literacy tests, we're now seeing, or poll taxes, we're now seeing voter ID laws. And Andrea said, yes, Charlottesville, we're still seeing voter intimidation. I participated in the Lawyers Committee Election Protection Hotline in 2020. And one of the most frequent calls that we got was voter intimidation. It's really alive and well. And, people face that when they went to go vote. So we actually launched a campaign called And Still I Vote in Selma, Alabama, during the 55th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. And it was actually the last trip we went to before the pandemic. And it was really to shine a spotlight on voter suppression and mobilize voters to take action. And we had a lot of celebrity influencers. Some of them were in the video who helped us mobilize voters in 2020. So now we're taking it to the next step. Now, people voted. We had the largest turnout despite so many barriers that voters faced. And so the leadership conference in our coalition, we have two main legislative priorities for the 117th Congress. The first one is For the People Act, which is HR 1. And I'm sure many of you have heard about it because it just passed the House last Thursday. And this is it's an omnibus bill. It's over 800 pages and it does three things. It increases voter access. It also has ethics reform and campaign finance reform. But the leadership conference really focuses on the voting rights provisions of the bill, which come from John Lewis's Voter Empowerment Act, which is a bill that he introduced Congress after Congress. And so the bill is really transformative because it has basically every voting reform that we would like to see in our country. And it creates national standards. So voters in California don't have different rules from voters in Georgia or voters in Texas. It's really about creating uniform standards. And it has reforms like nationwide automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration. It prevents felony disenfranchisement laws. It requires that nationwide states have at least 2 weeks of early voting. And it has protections against improper voter purges. That was noted in the video. A lot of voters have just been purged from the rolls in recent years. And it also has, increased vote by mail. And one thing that was really important is that Congress added some of the reforms that were implemented because of the pandemic, like expanded vote by mail drop boxes and curbside voting. So that's HR 1 for the People Act. It passed the House last Thursday, so now it's in the Senate. There's going to be a hearing in the Senate Rules Committee on March 24th, and we're expecting passage sometime this spring, early summer. So the second bill that we are focusing on is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that is HR 4. And that's really the fix to Shelby County versus Holder, that 2013 Supreme Court case that Ari and I talked about. So in that Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court gutted the preclearance provision. And so this bill aims to restore that provision. And the Supreme Court said, 1965 data was too old, come up with a formula that's more current. And so right now, this bill looks at the last 25 years. So it looks at jurisdictions that have been bad actors and have implemented just racial discriminatory voting laws over the last 25 years instead of all the way back to 1965. And those states and jurisdictions would have to have their policies and laws pre-cleared. It also provides nationwide preclearance for certain provisions that are known to discriminate against voters. So that means, it's an effort to not just pick on the South like so many people think, because there is voter discrimination all around the country. Just to tell a short story, I got my start in voting rights at an organization called Advancement Project, and I was on the team that sued the state of Wisconsin over their discriminatory voter ID law. And one of my witnesses, she was 90 years old. She was originally from Mississippi and moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin with her family during, after the Depression, during the Great Migration. And she was born at home to a midwife in Mississippi, never had a birth certificate. And her family actually had to spend over $2,000 in order for her to obtain a birth certificate. So that's a modern day poll tax. And that's something that happened in Wisconsin, right? That's not a state in the South. So the bill really aims to look at recent instances of voter discrimination. So that's HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. So those are our two legislative priorities, HR 1 and HR 4. But one thing I wanted to mention, and Ari touched on this earlier, there's also a Supreme Court case that's working its way through called Brnovich versus DNC. And it originates out of Arizona. It basically challenges Arizona's law that allows voters to collect vote by mail ballots and return them in, and also the law that allows voters who are in the wrong precinct to have their ballot counted. You know, a lot of times people are confused, or they vote in the wrong precinct and their ballot is thrown out in Arizona. A lot of states at least count the federal races or the top of the ballot. So there's a lawsuit right now before the Supreme Court. There were oral arguments in the case earlier this month. And it's just an effort really to further dismantle the Voting Rights Act. And so we're expecting a decision on that Supreme Court case the end of June, but it's just something to watch out for. You know, we're hoping that the Supreme Court does the right thing and protects the Voting Rights Act, but there's potential for further erosion. So that's why the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is even more critical, you know, because we need to have a mechanism to stop racial discriminatory voting laws.
Lee, I have one question for you, and then I'm going to follow up with Andrea. The question for you, Lee, is if we're talking about a real bundle of states now looking to pass voter suppression laws, if these state laws pass before H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 are passed by Congress, how does H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 impact the states? Let's say Arizona, Georgia, they pass all of their voter suppression laws. What is the outcome once H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 passes? Hopefully we'll make sure they pass.
Right. So, you know, right now, the only way to stop these bad bills is really to sue if they're passed, because we don't have preclearance. But if H.R. 1 passes, that implements national standards for voting around the country, then, you know, federal law trumps state law. But H.R. 1 only affects federal elections. So you could have a situation where you have different rules in federal elections and state elections, which can be a little bit challenging. And then with H.R. 4, you know, that bill really stops discriminatory laws and policies from going into effect. So basically, people would have to bring a lawsuit in order to stop it.
Okay. Now, Andrea, the Center for Common Ground is literally on the ground in all of these states, working hard to fight against these voter suppression bills. Can you tell us what those of us who aren't living in these states can do to help you and other voting rights groups who are fighting back as these voter suppression laws are wending their way through state legislatures?
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to drop our website in the chat. It's centerforcommonground.org. And right now at the top, there's one link that says Georgia. There's another one that says Arizona. Those are our phone banks where even if you don't live in what we call our target states, you can call voters who live in the target states. Let them know what's going on. Remember, I and my team, we read all the bills, the bad voting bills that get introduced in the various legislatures. Most people living their regular lives don't do that. They don't know where to do it. They don't know how to do it. And most people just don't have time to do it. So we call voters, we let them know what's going on and give them an opportunity to call their state representative or state senator, or sometimes we just shoot them a little text and say, hey, we've got this really neat tool where you can email, you can tweet, and or you can call, and you can share it with your family, your friends, and your neighbors. And so right now we're working with Georgia and Arizona because they still have live bills. As different legislators go out of session, and new ones come in with these bad bills, you're going to start seeing our phone banks move around to other states. So very, very important that we let voters know. In Georgia, the work that we have done so far, we've sent 36,429 emails, 1,245 tweets, and 707 phone calls. State legislators don't expect to get that volume of messages. That's kind of what happens in DC, not a state house. So while there were 45 of these really bad bills in Georgia, only a handful of those bills actually passed in the Senate and in the House, and will then cross over to the other chamber where they have to be voted on again. Now, again, Georgia and Arizona are both trifectas, Republican state house, Republican governor. If the bill passes out of the state house, the governors will sign it. So again, that is why we desperately need HR 1, where HR 1 says all states will have no excuse absentee voting. All states will have early voting. All states, if you have a past felony conviction and you are out of prison, you will be able to register and vote. That is why HR 1 is so critical. Remember, federal law, quote, trumps state law. So basically that federal law
overrides in this case.
Yes.
I quoted it.
I want to give a plug to Andrea's group. The Workers' Circle has been working since the last election with the Center for Common Ground, and we do these phone banking with the Center for Common Ground. And first of all, their technology is fantastic. It's a step-by-step calls. We do it, and I'm encouraging, because we have a lot of people watching. Organizations can partner, and the Center for Common Ground just sets you up so you can have kind of Zoom parties. And the people we call uniformly love getting our calls. So if you want to reach out, you can do it on your own. You can do it with different groups like ours. You can contact her. Everyone's going to get an email with information about all our panelists and how you can connect to all of these amazing organizations that are on the forefront of voter rights. But I just want to tell people, it's activism you can do from your home right now. And it's really satisfying, because the people you get your calls, they want to talk to you. And that's pretty exciting.
And right now, all the people that we're calling in Georgia and Arizona, all these people voted absentee by mail. I mean, in Arizona, they're trying to throw 200,000 people off the permanent early voting list. 2.3 million people in Arizona are over the age of 60. Come on, if anybody needs a permanent early voting list, Arizona is one of those states, and Arizona does not have same-day registration. So this is awful.
We're living in critical times, and it calls for critical activism. In that light, both Lee and Andrea, how about some closing remarks, and then we'll take some action together. Lee, I'll look to you first.
Sure. I just want to say thanks for having me here today to talk about the leadership conference and our priorities and the work that we're doing with our coalition. I would just say that, everything that's happening in the states as we speak is really evidence for why we need to have both of these federal bills, HR 1 and HR 4, and why we need to have more uniform standards for voting. We're seeing a backlash that we haven't seen in a long time. And honestly, it's really just going to get worse. So it's important for everyone who's on this call to talk to your friends and family, make sure that they know what's happening as far as the rollbacks to voting rights, because this is not how America should be. We should be living in a democracy where we encourage voter participation, where we want more people to vote, because You know, more voter access means we can work on the issues that we care about, right? We can work on education reform or healthcare reform or immigration reform, whatever it is that you care about. We need to make sure that we have a democracy where more people participate. So if you can please get engaged and call on Congress to pass HR 1 and HR 4, you know, it would really go a long way.
And thank you. And I really thank the Leadership Conference for their critical role in HR 1 and HR 4 and just protecting people's rights across this country. The Workers' Circle's been so proud to be partnering with you and taking your lead in this. So you're doing such important work, and may we all continue the work with each other. Now, Andrea, some closing remarks.
First of all, thank you, thank you, thank you. This is my idea of fun, talking to committed activists about what you can do to help ensure that others continue to be able to enjoy their ability to vote. What I think is really important about what we are doing is we are helping voters in these voter suppression states understand that they have a voice and their voice matters. 5 years ago, Virginia looked exactly like Georgia. And the main reason it's different today is people in Virginia decided enough is enough. We are done. And so we started standing up and we became activists on our own. Well, in places like Georgia and Arizona, people have been so beaten down, they don't realize that if they stand up and if they fight back, then they're already winning and the other side is really scared. So we're showing people that they have that voice and we are giving them a means where they can use it.
Thank you. Thank you for your inspiring final comments. And now we have some action that we can all take right now to strengthen our voting rights and push forward HR 1 and HR 4. I want to introduce my colleague, Noelle D'Amico, who's the Social Justice Director at the Workers' Circle, who's going to walk us through some steps we can take right now. And if everyone on this Zoom does it, we'll have hundreds upon hundreds of calls right now. So Noelle, please, I'm happy to welcome you to the panel.
Thanks. It's absolutely wonderful to be here, to be on the phone with hundreds of activists across the country. Thank you so much for being with us. And tonight, we want to take action together, to not just hear about what needs to be done, but to actually do it together. So you see on the screen before you, the Senate Switchboard Hotline. And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to call the number on that screen. You will be connected to either an operator or to a voice operator. When connected, if you know your senator's name, choose one. I'm from New York, so I might say, I'd like to speak with Senator Schumer, and they will connect you. If you get the automated voice that answers, you can say, I'd like to speak to the senators from New York. And they will give you an option. Would you like to speak to Senator Schumer or to Senator Gillibrand? So even if you don't know the names of your senators, just ask, and either the operator or the voice automated operator will tell you and connect you to their office. Once you reach their office, they are able to take high volumes of voicemails. So don't worry that we're all calling in at once. You'll say, hello, my name's Noelle. So I would say, hello, my name is Noelle D'Amico. I live in White Plains, New York. My zip code is 10601. Senator Schumer, I'm calling to urge you to stand up for democracy and for every American's right to vote by supporting the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We need to get big money out of politics, stop racialized partisan gerrymandering, and ensure every American has access to the ballot. Voter suppression has no place in our democracy. I urge your support for S1 and S4 because democracy can't wait. I'd love to hear from you. Give me a call at, if you would like to add that in, and your telephone number. It is that simple. So while this is on the screen right now, I invite you to dial that number while we're on this phone together and get those calls going. We're going to be standing by with a little soft music. Once you've left a message, come on back to the chat. We're opening up the chat right now, and let us know that you've left a message for your senator, for both if you have time. We're going to stay on the phone till about 8:15. Make your calls, report back into the chat, and let's see what kind of power we can get going. Get calling, friends. This is really great. Some people are able to reach their senators tonight. Bob is letting us know he called Minnesota and left messages. His 2 senators are supportive and he's going to spread the word. I'm sure many of you out there are still calling now. Some of you may have gotten dropped by the phone messaging system. That happened to me twice and I got through once. So we're going to be sure to send you this information in a follow-up email so that you can continue to make calls. We'll also send you the links from tonight. We'll send you the links to Andrea's Center for Common Ground so you can jump into that phone bank work, as well as other opportunities to learn more and take action. We're so glad you've been with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ann Tobeck.
I just want to thank all of you. I want to thank our panelists, Andrea, Noah, and Andrea Lee. I want to thank you, Noelle, for helping to organize tonight's panel, to our interpreters, to staff, and most importantly, I want to thank everyone who's joined us tonight. You are the activists on the ground. You are the people who are making change now and who will bring the critical change we need. Remember, this is a movement of all of us, and feet on the ground, phone calls across the states is what we need today, tomorrow, and to ensure that voter rights happen, that HR 1 and HR 4 pass, and we end this scourge of suppression so that everyone in the United States truly has the right to vote and knows that their vote will count. So thank you all for being a part of this, and I look forward to seeing you all at future programs and hopefully phone banking with you. Thank you again. Good night on behalf of the Workers' Circle and all of us here. Be well.